Would you pray with me, please? Holy One, some of us know what we need tonight, and some of us don't. What I do know is that we all need to feel your presence. We all need to feel your touch. We all need to feel your love surround us, and we all need to feel that extraordinary gift of grace that you lay upon us and draw us to your side with, that you remind us that we are your children. You remind us that we are part of your family. You remind us that you have a place for us that has been there since the beginning of time and will be there at the end of time. Whatever it is that we need tonight, Lord, I ask that you just come and that you meet that in your own amazing and special way. For we open ourselves to you and open our hearts to you so that we may receive a word from you. Bless the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts, that they may be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Amen. The scripture reading tonight is taken from Matthew chapter 7. And in all the New Testament, it's perhaps my favourite chapter. And the reason is because it's a really interesting teaching that Jesus shares with us, and it's all about stereotyping. And now that's probably not a word they had 2,000 years ago, but I believe that that's what it's all about, every single bit of it. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, and by a few I mean 20 odd, there was a story going around about an unusual spate of burglaries, an unusual spate of robberies. And the story went that somebody would receive a pair of tickets to the theatre, or a pair of tickets to a show, or a concert, and they'd go, and when they got home they'd find that their house was empty, or they'd been burgled and they'd been robbed, and in fact the whole thing was a setup, and the reason they got the tickets was because then, you know, robbers would know that they were out for the evening. Now, I don't know whether it's a true story or not. I mean, it may have just been one of those urban legends that go around. But I do remember that there was a joke that went around about the same time. And it went like this. Young couple go out to the cinema one night. When they get home, they find that they've been burgled. So she has a quick look around the place, and then she gets onto the police and she says, "Can you send someone round quick, please? We've been burgled by a couple of gays." At which point the police officer says, "Hang on a minute. How do you know it's a couple of gays?" And the woman says, "Well, they've rearranged all the furniture and there's a quiche in the oven." Now, at the time, I thought it was really funny. And the reason I thought it was funny was because, oddly enough, I was going through my furniture moving stage. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but what I would do is, if I found that I was having difficulty getting a handle on things, then I'd move all the furniture in the room around, clean behind everything, tidy up, make it all look different. And somehow, making everything look different out there and organised out there helped everything in here to get organised, and I'd sort it out. And it got to the point where I did it so often that Damien, my godson, said, "Mike, you've got to get a new hobby." So, and I remember, so I heard this joke and I thought, that's me because I move furniture. Of course then, two things occurred to me. The first one was that not all gay men did this. And in fact, my Auntie Vi did this. And I knew this because she had a really serious heart condition. And what she'd do is she'd start moving furniture, realise she couldn't do any more, and she'd call my mother around to say, "Can you help me please, because it's all in a pile in the middle of the room." So I knew that straight women did this as well as gay men. So, you know, it kind of falls down there. And then secondly, I realised that actually the joke's not about that at all. That actually, back in the 80s and 90s, it was about the whole stereotype that gay men were supposed to be interior designers. Now, of course, I fall down there completely because I can't design for toffee. In fact, I remember when we had a place in New York, we bought a couple of sofas, and I decorated, and I spent a week working out where one of the sofas should go. Should it go here against the wall, or should it go here next to the rug? And I spent a week worrying over this, moving it backwards and forwards, until eventually Chris came home and I said, look, I've had enough, I can't do this. It doesn't look right there, and it doesn't look right there, and Chris just put it in the middle, it was perfect. So, you know, I'm not one for designing rooms and doing furniture. And secondly, you know, I'm not a big lover of quiche. You know, I'm a meat and potato pie man, so I'm not really into baking quiche. So the whole thing falls down on that stereotype. But that some people would think that all gay men are interior designers who like quiche is kind of really odd. But invariably people did, because that's why they found the joke funny. The odd thing about stereotypes is that, unfortunately, it's natural for us to stereotype. And the reason is because the world is a complicated place. And there's so much going on all the time that our mind has to categorize things in order to cope with everything. So it's the natural function of our mind to put things into categories. Now that's fine if you're looking at dogs and cats and all the rest of it. And you can tell that the mind does this because the odds are that if you're savaged by one dog, you're going to avoid all dogs. And if you're scratched badly and made ill by one cat, you're going to avoid all cats. And that's because the brain just sticks all dogs or all cats into categories, into one lump. But of course, it's great if you're thinking about dangerous plants or animals that are dangerous or things that you need to avoid or things that you're going to like. But when it comes down to people, it doesn't work because people are individuals. But our brain still does exactly the same thing and wants to lump people into categories. And it's those categories that we see as stereotypes. Now, we don't just do it ourselves. What we do is that then quite often we assume that God's like us, and that's what God does. We assume that God does exactly the same thing, and that God needs to put everything into categories. So you've got categories of good people, and you've got categories of bad people. You've got categories of things that God loves and things that God hates. Things that are considered sins and things that are considered righteousness. You've got these categories, and we assume that because we do this, because that's the function of the human being to do this, we assume that God does the same thing. Which is ridiculous, because God's not like us. God doesn't have a little brain like us. God is infinite. So God doesn't need to put anybody into a category. God can meet us all individually. Which is exactly what Matthew chapter 7 is all about. It's all about the difference between the way that we often see the world and the way that God sees the world, the way that we see each other and the way that God sees us. So, if you have an app for this, or you've got a Bible, we're in Matthew chapter 7, and I just want to walk through it with you, just so that you get a handle on what's going on. It says, verse 1, "Do not judge, that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged. And the measure you give will be the measure you get." Now, unfortunately, this comes with a lot of baggage for most of us, because most of us have been brought up in Christian households. So let's just change a word here and see how we get on with it. Let's change the word judge to stereotype. Do not stereotype, so that you may not be stereotyped. For with the stereotype that you make, you will be stereotyped. And the measure you give will be the measure you get. So, if you've got the kind of mind that stereotypes everybody and puts everybody into categories, well, guess what? You're going to put yourself into categories as well. And because you know more about yourself than anybody else, and you know all the things that you fall down on, then you're going to be trying your best to fulfill these categories that actually nobody could possibly fill, which makes life a living hell. So, the more that you do it with other people, and you put other people into categories, instead of seeing people as individuals, you see them as a list of things that they do and don't do, then the more that you see people that way, the more you see yourself that way. And that's no way to live a life. Jesus says, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbour's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbour, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbour's eye." Now, what Jesus is not saying here is he's not saying, do you know what? Don't judge somebody else, because guess what? You've done much, much worse. So you've got a big log of things in your own eye. Get rid of all those things that you're doing wrong, and then you can see what somebody else is doing wrong. He's not saying that. But it's natural to think that if that's the way that we think. If we think in terms of categories, if we think in terms of stereotyping, then that's the way we're going to understand it. But that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, the log in your own eye is the paradigm through which you see the other person. Because you don't see them. What you see is a list of things they do and don't do that you approve of or don't approve of, or you think that God approves of or doesn't approve of, or God likes or doesn't like, or are sinful or not sinful. And that's what you see. That's the log in your eye. If you get rid of that, then suddenly you'll go, there's a person. And you'll get to know that person. And then if there's a speck in their eye, you'll know it because it's something that's not congruent with them. You'll know that there's something that's wrong because it's something that they wouldn't normally do, something that they wouldn't normally be. And that's easy when we love someone. That happens naturally when we're in love with someone, but when we're not, we just don't see it, we don't do it. Jesus says then, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, for they will trample them under their foot and turn around and maul you. What he's saying is, this is all very well, however, now you understand this pearl of wisdom, don't think that everyone's going to understand it. Because if you go out there shouting this off, then what's going to happen is people who see the world that way are going to get really, really angry with you. And you're going to have real problems. And what happens is a short while later, he gets taken for the cross and nailed to it and killed for exactly that reason. For exactly that reason. He says, ask and it will be given you. Search and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Then he says, for everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and for everyone that knocks the door will be opened. Is there any among you who has a child, asks for bread, will give a stone? Or if the child asks for a fish, will give a snake? If you then, who are evil, because that's the way you think about yourself, he says, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will God in heaven give good gifts to those who ask for them? Everyone. You know what? You think that God only gives gifts to people who behave in this way. Guess what? Everyone. The point is that somebody's knocking, somebody's searching, somebody's asking. That's the point. Not whether they fulfill a certain set of criteria, not whether or not they fulfill a righteous stereotype, whatever that is. And then he just ties the whole thing up and says, in everything, do to others as you would have them do unto you. That's it. Nice and simple. For this is the law and the prophets. This is what it's all about. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few that find it. Why? Why is it a narrow gate? Is it because it's so difficult to keep a whole list of rules and regulations? No. Actually, the reason is because it's a one-person path. It's yours. Nobody else can walk it. Nobody else can tell you where it leads. The only one that can walk it with you is God. And the reason it's difficult is because it's yours. It's much easier to get with another group of people. It's much easier to go to a church where everybody's supposed to think the same and do the same and be the same, because then you kind of feel safe because you're the same as everybody else. But guess what? That's a living hell. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, and a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them by their fruits. Then he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of God in heaven. On that day, many will come to me and say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many deeds of power in your name? And I'll declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you evildoers. Because guess what? You thought that what I wanted was for you to fulfill this list of rules and regulation that you got from your priest, your rabbi, your whatever, and you thought that that was what I was all about. And guess what? It's not. I don't want any of that. I want you. In fact, I can't see you because you're so busy running around trying to make yourself into something that you're not, I've never met the person that you are. And guess what? Some of the things that you have done in my name, like, for example, sending your kids off into the cold because they happen to be gay or lesbian or bi or trans, or pregnant, or like rock music, or whatever it may be, the things that you've done in my name, not only would I not sanction them, I think they're positively evil. In fact, I do not want to be associated with those things. You know, just get away from me, you evildoers. Which is exactly what he's saying. He says, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like the wise person who built their house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the wind blew and beat on the house, but it didn't fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like the foolish person who built their house on sand. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house and it fell and great was its fall. I remember being Jehovah's Witness, 20 years old, and they found out that I was gay. And the house that I lived in, metaphorically, which was my religion, my family, my friends, my job, where I lived, all of that came down with a huge crash, an absolute crash. Because actually, the only sure foundation on which to build the house is you. Is on the truth of who you are, of who God has made you to be. That's the foundation on which we build. Because then what happens is that whenever the storms come, we get through them. Because we're standing by our own truth. We're standing by what we know to be true because it's within us, because we live it. It says, now when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as their scribes. Because he knew what he was talking about. He knew exactly what he was talking about. And he wasn't pulling his punches. One of the challenges, I think, is that even if we don't have a religious background, we can still fall into the same trap of stereotyping. Because we assume that people who are Christian or religious or whatever are like this or like that. And it's very easy for us to categorize, put people in categories, rather than get to know them and find out who they are. Sometimes categories are good things. If somebody runs towards you wielding a knife, they're probably dangerous. Run away. That category is a good one. But that somebody believes differently, or has a different faith, or has a different view on the world, or a different kind of relationship with God, is no reason to put them in a box with a whole load of other people that you think might be like them. But it might be a good reason to get to know them a little bit and find out what your common ground is. Because when you do that, you get to know who they are. And when you get to know who they are, you'll get to know the person that God knows. And if you are living your own truth, then they will get to know who you are and who God knows. And then Jesus will know exactly who you are. Which is the whole point. That which is Christ in one another recognizes one another. Amen.